So, here it is, joke number 100. Wahey! What am I doing with my life? This next joke concerns itself with a man called Keith. Now, Keith is quite famous in the comedy circuit, for he's known as the king of the hecklers, the king of wit and repartee. He goes to comedy gigs with his mates, he has a few pints, and he'll shout out something with such devastating humour that in many cases comedians have actually had to walk off the stage because they've just not been able to come back with any kind of put down or any retort to Keith's killer heckles. And Keith and his friends were looking for something to do, and they noticed in their road that there were lots of posters on all the lampposts advertising a circus that had come to town. And they thought, for a change, rather than going along to a comedy gig, they would go along to a circus instead. And Keith and his friends got tickets and went along that evening, and they sat in the front row in the circus ring. And they sat through trapeze artists and high wire walkers and jugglers and fire eaters and lion tamers. And eventually Bobo the Clown came into the ring. And Bobo the Clown was wearing a spectacular red clown outfit with bright green hair and a little blue top hat on his head, and he was wearing great big funny clown shoes. And he walked around the ring carrying a bucket, and because of his great big shoes it looked like he was going to fall over at any minute. And as he walked around the ring he got closer and closer to Keith, and suddenly he did trip over those great big clown shoes, and when he did, he threw the bucket all over Keith. But rather than being filled with water, the bucket was filled with blue glitter, and the entire audience burst into laughter. It was the funniest thing they'd ever seen, and Keith sat there covered from head to toe in shining blue glitter. And suddenly the audience hushed, for they noticed that it wasn't just a normal innocent member of the audience. Bobo the Clown had just thrown a bucket of blue glitter over the UK's foremost heckler, the king of wit and repartee. Keith himself had just been made to look like an idiot by Bobo the Clown. And in the silence that followed, Keith stared at Bobo, and Bobo stared back at Keith. The audience still hushed with anticipation. What was Keith going to say? They'd heard him destroy so many comedians. Keith was going to absolutely annihilate Bobo the Clown. But nothing happened. Keith sat there staring at Bobo, and nothing sprung into his head. He couldn't think of a single funny thing to say to Bobo the Clown. Suddenly, through the silence, the audience started laughing. They weren't laughing at Bobo the Clown. They weren't laughing at the humorous water bucket filled with blue glitter routine he'd just done. They were laughing at Keith. They were laughing at Keith because Keith had not been able to come up with a single put down, and Keith left the circus that night and went back to his house, and he sat in his living room shaking his head in disbelief. He'd finally been beaten by a comedian. Bobo the Clown had destroyed him. He did think for a while about maybe getting a new job, but then he decided that actually no, I'm going to return to that circus. I'm going to return to that circus a funnier man, better prepared. So he went to his bookcase and he got a copy of Joe Pasquale's autobiography, and he read that autobiography from cover to cover, taking inspiration from one of Britain's greatest ever comedians. And the following day, filled with a newfound confidence, Keith went to the circus box office and bought another ticket for that night's show. And he took his seat in the ring, same seat as the night before, and Bobo the Clown entered the ring after the jugglers, the high wire walkers, the fire eaters and the lion tamer. And Bobo the Clown this time was going around and was doing balloon modelling for some of the children that were sat in the circus. And he walked his way round the ring and eventually got round to Keith. And Bobo recognised Keith from the night before. And he knew now who Keith was. He knew that Keith was the king of wit and repartee. But Bobo figured, I've beaten him once, I'll beat him again. So he said to Keith, do you want to smell my flower? And he pointed at a flower that was pinned on his lapel. And Keith went, all right, and he leant forward to sniff Bobo's flower. And Bobo, you won't believe what he did, he squirted Keith in the face with water from his comedically large flower. And the entire audience burst into laughter again. And again there was a hush when they realised that the man who was sat on the front row in that circus was none other than Keith, the king of the hecklers, the king of wit and repartee. And during that silence, Keith stared at Bobo and Bobo stared back at Keith. And once again, nothing. Keith couldn't think of a single funny thing to say. Normally his devastating heckles could destroy a comedian, but tonight, nothing. Bereft of any inkling of something funny to say to put down Bobo the Clown in his red coat with his little blue hat, his great big yellow bow tie and his enormous squirting water flower. And Keith went home that night and again sat in his living room. He couldn't believe it. 2 nights running Bobo the Clown had outsmarted him. And Keith sat for a while in his living room, shaking his head, wondering what to do with his life. And again he suddenly thought, you know what? I can beat this clown. I can do this. I can heckle Bobo the Clown. So he went to his DVD cabinet and he took out DVDs of improvisation. He watched Have I Got News For You on repeat. He watched Jimmy Carr DVDs, Frankie Boyle DVDs. He watched Michael McIntyre DVDs to get inspiration. And having watched DVDs all through the night, bleary-eyed, Keith walked to the circus box office, all the while thinking, you know what? I have learnt from the comedy masters. I have watched Joe Pasquale DVDs, Jim Davidson DVDs. I am now undefeatable. And he went and purchased a ticket from the ticket office. And he went to the circus that night and he took his seat. And he sat through the tightrope walkers and the jugglers and the fire eaters and the lion tamer until Bobo the Clown came out, his adversary. And Bobo the Clown was walking round the ring this time with a custard pie in his hand. And he walked round the ring talking to people and pretending to trip over his shoes. And when he reached Keith, he took that custard pie and he slammed it in Keith's face. And the entire audience burst into laughter. And Keith wiped the custard from his face. And people in the audience suddenly went quiet. Once again they knew it was Keith, the king of wit and repartee, the man with the funniest put-downs and heckles of any other man in the United Kingdom. And a silence fell. And Keith stared at Bobo. And Bobo stared back at Keith. And Keith stared at Bobo. And Bobo stared back at Keith. The entire audience hushed. They'd heard rumours that Keith had been destroyed the previous 2 nights, and many of them had actually bought tickets for the circus because they knew that surely Keith this time was going to destroy Bobo the Clown. And Keith closed his eyes and he summoned the wisdom of the comedians that he'd watched the previous night. He remembered the words of Joe Pasquale's book echoing through his mind, and he was finally ready with his witty retort. And he looked at Bobo, and Bobo looked back at him, and Keith said to Bobo, "Piss off, you red-nosed twat!"